Your car guy here. Today we're working on the 2007 Yukon Denali, and what we've got going on is we've got a bad wheel bearing here on the passenger side. So we're going to change the wheel bearing. We're also going to change the CV axles. The reason I'm changing the CV axles is because we've got some torn boots on them. I'll show you that when we get a little bit deeper in. But we'll do it while we're doing the wheel bearing. I got to have the axle out on this side anyway. They're really easy to change. So got the vehicle up, secured on jack stands. Notice the jack is just there underneath it. It is not holding the vehicle, the jack stands are. We've got the wheels chalked in the back to make sure it doesn't roll. First thing we'll do, we'll take a 22mm socket and remove the lug nuts and get the wheel out of our way. With the wheel out of the way, you can see easily my broken boot here, which, well, not necessarily guaranteeing that I've got a bad axle and you could just replace the boot. But I've got about 200,000 miles on this truck now. It's a good time to put the axles in. The kit that I bought came with new axles, so we're just gonna go ahead and take the axles out while we're at it and do everything at once. But next step, we're gonna take this ABS wire loose. You'll see right up here, we have a connection that has a tab right on top, right there, that you will push down and slide the wire out. Now the actual sensor itself drops through on this and we can pry it up out. We'll also have this connection here that'll need to come pried up out, and this connection here that will pry out. We'll get that off to the side and so it's out of our way before we take off the brake caliper assembly. So if you press down on that little tab, you can then pull out the wire from the back there. So the little tab right where my finger is, we'll press down and pull out. For pulling these sensors up, I like to take a pair of pliers or side cutters that I can reach underneath with, and I just create a little fulcrum point and pry them up and out. We'll do the same thing here. We'll just get up underneath it and pry it up and out. And then this one is a little bit different in that it's got tabs that if I push on both sides with a flat blade screwdriver or with a pair of pliers, I can push these side tabs in on both sides, and then I'll just simply be able to pull it right out. With the ABS sensor wiring out of the way, the next thing we're gonna do is remove the two mounting bolts right here and right here. Those are 18mm bolt heads, and we'll be able to take the entire caliper bracket and caliper off. When I pull it off, I'm gonna set it right up here, making sure not to strain or pinch my hose. Then I'm gonna take some zip ties and zip tie it up here so that it's not gonna fall and put any damage or strain on that brake hose. So now that I've got my brake bracket loose, I'm gonna actually reach with a flat screwdriver right in through this slot on top, and I'm gonna pry towards me just gently, and that's gonna help relieve the hydraulic pressure that's holding that up. And then you can see that the whole caliper assembly comes off very easily, and I can set it up here where it's not gonna fall and break that hose, but then I will use some zip ties to hold it up that I can cut off when I'm ready to reinstall it. Now that I have the caliper bracket up, up and secured, we're gonna use a T30 Torx, and we're gonna remove the bolt that holds the brake rotor on, and then we'll be able to pull the brake rotor off. All right, with our rotor out of the way, we're gonna go ahead and take a 36mm socket and remove the axle nut. Then we can go underneath and remove the bolts that you can just see right there behind the shock that go around the axle flange so that we can push the axle back out of the wheel hub. Got our axle nut off. Next step, we're gonna remove these 15mm bolts and take that axle flange loose. All right, we've got our axle bolts out, but we're gonna need room to get our axle out of here. It's loose on this end, it's loose on that end. You'll find too that with, there may be some rust that holds it in here. You may have to gently tap it out. If you're gonna reuse your axle, you wanna be careful so you don't damage these threads. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove these lower bolts that come up into the bottom of the strut here. We'll take them out, and then we can push the strut with a pry bar off of the lower control arm, and that will give us the room to manipulate the axle. The strut will have some movement then, and we'll have plenty of room. From underneath, here's your strut bolts, one here, 15 millimeter, and you'll be able to just whip them right out. With our lower strut bolts removed, we'll take a pry bar up underneath between the strut and the lower control arm, and we can just pry the strut backwards until it comes off. And it does have some spring tension on it from the coil spring here. Not too much. It's going to drop down maybe an inch or two when we push it out. In order to get a little more flexibility, we're going to go ahead and take the 3 top strut bolts loose. I'll leave one nut in so that the strut won't drop all the way, but it'll be able to swing back and forth. So we'll take 2 of these out and leave one in. We'll pop the hood and do that. All right, from up top here, it can be a little hard to see, but it's really not hard to get to. Our 3 strut bolts, there's one, if I can get it positioned right there. Another one with that brown cap we'll have to just pry up, and the one right there that's got that ballast resistor zip tied to it. We'll take those zip ties loose, and we can get right to these from the top, or you can even do it with a ratchet through the fender well. All right, you'll see that I've got the nuts off, but I've left that one partially on. That way, when I go to pry this loose, the strut's still held up in place. The brake caliper that's tied to it will still be in place, but it's gonna give it the flexibility I need to move out and then be able to get this axle out. You can see with the strut out of the way, we can now let the back of the axle come down below the flange on the front differential. Then we're just gonna gently tap it out from the front here, and we'll be able to slide it right out underneath the truck. If the axle doesn't want to come out all the way, take a punch, good sturdy one, get it in the center of the axle. There's an indentation there, so you're not going to damage the axle. Then you can tap on the end with a hammer. Now with the axle out, you can actually hear how bad that bearing is. Now mind you, I've had much worse ones before. But next step, we're going to remove the 3 bolts. There's one here, one over here, and one up here that mount this hub to the spindle assembly. Now looking at this, there's a lot of corrosion and dirt, and there's a good chance that this spindle's not going to want to come out, or the hub's not going to want to come out really easily. But I'll show you how to do that. So first things first, we'll get our bolts broken loose. Like most of the bolts you're doing today, these are 15 millimeter. So now this one is very seized in with the rust. So what I've done is I've taken the bolts all the way out, and I'm taking a small screwdriver and I'll wedge it in as I get a little bit of clearance between the spindle and the new hub. And then I'll take a good heavy hammer and beat around the outside of my old hub, because it's the bad part that I'm replacing anyway, so I can beat on it. And then I'll keep working that deeper in to help push that out. And you just have to work it back and forth. The more you hit it, you can put a little PB blaster or WD-40 or some sort of penetrating oil in there that can help. But just keep working, take your time, don't get too frustrated, and eventually you'll work it out. And you can increasingly go with a bigger wedge, chisel, or a screwdriver. I start with a fairly small fine point just because that's all you get to get in there, and start just tapping it open. All right, it just took a little bit more persuasion and this came out. Now, we're gonna wanna save this dust cover for reuse. So we'll just slide that out and we'll set it aside. Now, before we go and put the new hub in, we'll wanna clean this out, maybe even take a little sandpaper, clean that up, get all that gunk out of there so that we've got a good surface. So we'll just work all the way around there and clean this up. All right, we've got our new hub assembly. We're gonna go ahead and put it through the wiring through the dust cover here. Now, if you look at the dust cover, it has, let me get that focused, that notch for clearance for the sensor right there. I'm sorry about the camera work. I'm trying to do this with one hand here. So we'll get that on and we'll set it in place. I'll show you that here in just a second. So here it is, our new hub is on. We've got our wheel speed sensor run through our dust cover here. I've got all 3 bolts in and just hand tight. Next, we're gonna go ahead and tighten them up and then we will torque them. All right, we've torqued our 3 mounting bolts to 133 foot-pounds. Next, we're gonna install our axle. We'll take and come up through that spot right there and slide it in and into the hub, and then we can push the back up onto the spindle there and install the mounting bolts back there. All right, our new axle is slid into place. With our mounting bolts back here at the differential, those will be torqued to 58 foot-pounds. We'll torque those. And then the axle nut will torque to 177 foot-pounds. However, when you get to this, you're probably gonna have to go ahead and put the brakes and everything back on, and then you can have someone sit in the vehicle and hold the brake before you put the wheel on while you torque this. That way it keeps it from rotating, because even with the vehicle in park, this is gonna wanna rotate and the tire on the other side is gonna wanna rotate. So going ahead and putting your brakes all together, then have somebody hold the brake pedal and it'll torque up. So I'm gonna torque those. Then we're gonna go ahead and we'll reinstall our brakes and reinstall our strut. When you go to reinstall your brake rotor, make sure to line up the spot for your retaining bolt with the tapped hole for it. You'll see that it sits between the 2 lugs there. So we'll line that up and then we'll put our bolt back in. With our brake rotor on, we'll slip our caliper assembly into place, and then we will install our 2 mounting bolts and torque them. With our caliper mounting bolts installed, we're gonna torque these to 148 foot-pounds. So I had my assistant hold the brakes while we torqued this down to 177. You can go 177 to 200 foot-pounds, right in that range. Now we'll go ahead and plug back in our ABS sensor. So we'll reconnect these retainers, that's really what they are, just by sliding them down into the holes where they came out of. And then plugging it back in up here, making sure that it comes together and locks in place. All right, for getting the strut back in place, simply tighten up your top bolts. Then with it hanging down, you can push down on the lower control arm and the strut will pop up into place for you. All right, we got everything is on and torqued. We've got our strut remounted. Everything's back in place. Now we're just gonna put our wheel on and we will torque our lug nuts. Final step is to torque our lug nuts to 140 foot-pounds. So that's it. We were able to get this done. We got the axle changed. We've changed the hub. It's a good time too. If you've got brakes to do, you can do the brakes, but I've got another video on the brakes on this vehicle, so you can look that up if you need to do brakes. This is your car guide. Please subscribe to the channel, like and share the videos, and help us grow.